Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 424. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. A lot of news to talk about on today's show, including the plan to send F-16s to Ukraine. This is a major escalation, and I will be breaking it down on today's show. Share the show, hosted at the Libertarian Institute. Of course, it's on the blog at antiwar.com. YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee for the video version of the show, and it's up anywhere you can listen to podcasts. And with that, let's get into today's news. First story today, I wrote for antiwar.com on May 19th. Biden to greenlight allies transferring F-16s to Ukraine. The U.S. will allow its European partners to transfer F-16s to Ukraine, according to the Washington Post. Earlier this week, the UK and the Netherlands began forming a coalition to send American-made fighter jets to Ukraine. A person familiar with the decision told the Post that the White House informed its allies it would not block their plans to provide Kiev with F-16s. When Washington sells F-16s to a buyer, that buyer must agree to that the U.S. government can block the planes being transferred to a third country. A senior administration official said the plans would include training on fourth-generation fighter aircraft, including F-16s, to further strengthen and improve the capabilities of the Ukrainian Air Force. The official continued, as the training takes place over the coming months, our coalition of countries participating in this effort will decide when to actually provide the jets, how many will be provided, and who will be providing them. Adding the training will take place outside of Ukraine at sites in Europe and will require months to complete. So this is something the Biden administration has started to do around NATO membership for Ukraine too, where they kind of pretend like, oh, we really don't have a say. We're just seeing what our allies want, when, of course, the U.S. holds, I think, 10 times more or 100 times more F-16s than the next countries. I think the U.S. has over 2,000, so 10 times more than Turkey with 200 or so. And Turkey won't be transferring them. So the countries that will be transferring these planes, of course, have a far smaller number than the U.S. So if the U.S. wanted to send a lot, of course, it would probably require American participation. The U.S. could cut off any country from sending the F-16. So, to just pretend like this is all up to our allies is a really annoying thing that the administration is doing. And they're doing the same thing with NATO membership for Ukraine. They're saying, well, it's up to the members of NATO and our allies. Well, the U.S. is the most important member of NATO. So if we don't want Ukraine to join NATO, then Ukraine won't join NATO. But if we do, then Ukraine probably will be able to. All right, moving on in the article here, the U.S. and the U.K. have already started training a limited number of Ukrainian pilots on the Western aircraft. So, from my understanding, this was supposed to be just a handful of Ukrainian pilots in the U.S. I don't know how extensive the U.K. training was. My guess is that this isn't enough to really start deploying the F-16s to Ukraine, and so we're going to do a larger training program here, and the planes actually going to Kiev, I think we're still a year off or so. Now, I could be wrong on that, and maybe they have already trained some pilots somewhat proficiently, and we are within a few months of being able to put the first few F-16s into Ukraine with pilots. Now, there's a lot more that goes on to this, too. It's not just training the pilots. You got to train the ground crews. You got to have the runways all set up and ready to go. There's, the F-16 is a far more advanced aircraft than the MiG-29 that I think is probably the most advanced fighter jet Ukraine has had. So, the runways need to be upgraded. I'm sure there's other kinds of just things that Ukraine's needs on a logistical level, like if the fuel hose attachment isn't the same for the MiG and the F-16, then you'll need to supply those, and whatever else the F-16 particularly needs to be able to take off land, take off again. Training on how to do at least some minor repairs, I'm assuming, replace parts, things like all this is going to take some time. Additionally, my guess is that there's a pretty big difference between being able to just fly an F-16 and launch a attack on the ground, and then potentially doing some aerial evasive maneuver, say if you're engaged by air defenses or an enemy aircraft. And so, what level is the U.S. and our allies really looking to train the Ukrainian pilots to? I think could be another question here. If they just want them to carry out, again, ground support kind of bombing runs, then maybe the training length can be shortened, where if you want them to be proficient in, say, dogfighting, it's going to take a lot more time. So, yeah, lots of questions to be answered here. Again, my assumption all along was that the F-16s were going to go to Ukraine, but the West wasn't going to make this announcement until they were within a few months of being able to ready to put F-16s into Ukraine. So, maybe I'm right, and they really are thinking that sometime this summer, sometime in the next, sometime in the fall, that they're really going to look to deploy the F-16s to Ukraine. But I don't know. I guess from everything I've read about how complicated they are, I'm thinking 2024 and mid to late 2024 is probably more the timeline that we're looking at here. So I just have a few more notes here. In his many appeals for advanced weapons from his Western partners, Ukrainian President Zelensky has pledged not to use the weapons to attack Russian territory. However, that pledge does not extend to the Crimean Peninsula, which was annexed by Moscow in 2014. Additionally, documents included in the Discord leaks show Zelensky was plotting attacks on Russia, notwithstanding his many promises. For several months, and really essentially since the start of the war, Zelensky has demanded F-16s. Biden appears to have changed his mind in the run-up to the Group of Seven summit in Hiroshima, Japan. The Guardian reported that Washington's sudden reversal shocked some allies. Things are moving really fast in Japan, faster even than we had dared hoped, one European diplomat said. Zelensky did attend the summit, the G7 summit in Japan, which happened this past weekend, and he celebrated the news on Twitter. I welcome the historic decision of the United States and Biden to support an international fighter coalition. This will greatly enhance our army in the sky. I count on discussing the practical implementation of this at the G7 summit in Hiroshima. So when I wrote that article on Friday, we had not heard the Russian response, and then Dave DeCamp wrote this up for the antiwar.com on May 21st. He says, a Russian official on Saturday said that Western plans to provide Ukraine with American-made F-16 fighter jets brings colossal risks after the U.S. announced it would sign off on European countries delivering the aircraft. And then this is the Russian deputy foreign minister, and he said, we see that Western countries adhering to the escalation scenario, it involves colossal risk for themselves. In any case, this will be taken into account in all of our plans, and we will have the necessary means to achieve whatever goals that we set. So this is something that I've talked about on the show in the past quite a bit, and that is the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov had laid out that his position was that, and that the Kremlin's position was that if the West provided Ukraine with longer range weapons, Russia would respond by taking more Ukrainian territory. And this was in line with their war goals, because their issue was that NATO was encroaching too close to Russia's heartland. And so by taking more Ukrainian territory, given the amount of weapons that the West sends Ukraine, it ensures that NATO isn't able to deploy their weapon systems any closer to Moscow. So, with the F-16s, this is a pretty serious escalation, pretty significant escalation compared to the weapons that the West has provided Ukraine so far. So I'm not sure what this means also logistically and then practically for what Russia is willing to lose after the fighting that we've seen in Bakhmut. Now, look, I guess I should say this, because we'll talk about Bakhmut falling in a little bit. We never know, right? In the moment, right now, we don't know if Russia was fighting a protracted battle for Bakhmut in order to destroy the Ukrainian army, or if Ukraine assessed that it was taking out more of Russia's forces than that was an acceptable ratio for them, and so they kept fighting for that city, even though it didn't hold very much strategic importance. However, assuming that part of the reason that offensive took so long is because it's difficult for Russia to take territory against what we have now in Ukraine is essentially a NATO trained and supplied army, then maybe it's really not possible for Russia to push all the way to Kiev at this point. And so even though they would like to take more territory based on the West providing F-16s to Ukraine, how possible is that? How much is Russia willing to lose? We'll really have to see, in the months ahead. And so, there's a lot of speculation that we could have right now. I should mention this. Colin Powell, Undersecretary for Defense Policy, previously told Congress that training could take 18 to 24 months, but other Pentagon officials have said that could take 4 to 9 months. So there's a pretty wide range on when even Pentagon officials are estimating Ukraine will be ready to deploy these aircraft. All right, next up here, Biden met with Zelensky in Hiroshima and then announced a new aid package. President Biden on Sunday met with Ukrainian President Zelensky during the G7 summit and announced a new military aid package for Kiev worth $375 million. I am announcing the next tranche of U.S. security assistance to Ukraine, a package that includes more ammunition, artillery, armored vehicles to bolster Ukraine's battlefield abilities, Biden said, alongside Zelensky. The funds for the new weapons package are being drawn from the $45 billion Congress authorized to spend on the war in December. Recent media reports said the U.S. aid for Ukraine might be exhausted by midsummer, and the White House will have to ask Congress for more. And so just to quickly go over what was in the $375 million package, additional ammunition for the HIMARS, 155 millimeter and 105 millimeter artillery rounds, tube-launched, optically tracked, wire-guided tow missiles, Javelin and AT-4 anti-armor systems, laser-guided rocket system munitions, demolition munitions, armored bridging systems, armored medical treatment vehicles, trucks and trailers to transport heavy equipment, logistics support equipment, thermal imagery systems, spare parts, and other field equipment. The Pentagon says that this package brings the total U.S. military aid that has been provided since Russia invaded Ukraine last year to over $37.3 billion. I think that that's an undercount. I think if we look at the Kiel Institute for World Policy, that's a German outlet that seems fairly pro Ukraine as far as it goes. It seems to me that that number is quite a bit higher, and when you look at the training and other money the U.S. has spent, it's substantially higher than the $37 billion the Pentagon is saying. Now, this is kind of interesting. So, Pentagon overvalued weapons sent to Ukraine by $3 billion. According to a report from Reuters, the Pentagon overestimated the value of military equipment it sent to Kiev by $3 billion, meaning the U.S. could ship even more weapons to the country. So we talked about this last week, right? That Politico had issued a report last week that said there was only about $6 billion left in funds for the U.S. to send to Ukraine, and that would dry up sometime by midsummer. Now the Pentagon is saying that, we didn't do our accounting quite right. And on that $37 billion, we overvalued it by $3 billion, which seems like it has to be a huge accounting error to not be able to get, a smaller margin of error on that. $300 million on $37 billion. That seems like the kind of accounting the government could kind of mess up on. But we're talking 10 times that. And so I have to wonder, I have to suspect here that the Pentagon is worried that they're going to have to ask for more money, or the White House is going to have to ask for more money from Congress, as either Ukraine admits that it can't launch a counteroffensive, it has just lost Bakhmut, or it has to admit that it can't, it launches a counteroffensive and it doesn't pan out. And whichever one of those scenarios it is, I think they've kind of decided that they need more time before they go ask Congress for weapons, because we've even heard some very hawkish members of Congress say that, support for Ukraine is contingent upon them being able to launch a successful counteroffensive. And so if that is even a little bit the case, then, you do some accounting, some fancy accounting, and you say, actually the way it's working, we got another $3 billion to send to Ukraine, because the Pentagon can't pass an audit anyways. There's no inspector general to look at this money, so that they could say whatever they want. And then therefore they buy themselves more time before they have to go back to Congress. And I shouldn't say they could say whatever they want. They could substantially fudge the numbers, right? $3 billion here is probably something they could sway on, $37 billion, where they couldn't just make up another $30 billion. So I do think they'll have to go back to Congress eventually, but not yet. And looks like they bought themselves just a little bit of more time. Next up here, U.S. announces new Russian sanctions with G7 nations. All right. Dave DeCamp writes, the U.S. on Friday announced new sanctions on Russia that were imposed in the coordination with the Group of Seven, but fall short of what the Biden administration was hoping to achieve. According to the Treasury Department, 300 sanctions were implemented on individuals, entities, vessels, and aircraft. The measures are meant to combat the circumvention of and evasion of Western sanctions on Russia. The joint statement said, we are imposing further sanctions and measures to increase the cost to Russia and those that are supporting the war effort. Ahead of the Group of Seven, the U.S. was pushing the G7 to agree to a full export ban on Russia, but the EU and Japan were against the plan and said it wasn't realistic. German officials also said this. The export ban would have exemptions for medicine and agricultural goods, but as we know, exemptions really don't work when it comes to export ban embargo style sanctions. So as I wrote before, I think the sanctions are more symbolic than actually impactful, given how much of the Russian economy is already sanctioned. They probably already sanctioned a lot of the businesses in Russia, a lot of the owners of those businesses in Russia. And so now they're starting to sanction the ships and the planes that those, people and businesses own, as maybe they attempt to do some fancy bureaucratic business kind of stuff to say, we really don't own this plane anymore, so it could be a part of this or that, or things like that. They're trying to cut, but it's not actually adding any significant sanctions against Russia, and likely Russia will, the Russian people within Russians, right, are going to find ways around the sanctions and to do business. All right, this is one of the more scary escalations that I've seen recently. I guess the F-16s are worse, but this is still a really big deal. NATO to draw up Russia war plans for the first time since the Cold War. According to Reuters, the upcoming NATO summit in July, alliance leaders will approve thousands of pages of secret military plans that will detail on how to respond to a Russian attack. The plans will be vastly different than anything drawn up during the Cold War, as NATO has expanded from 16 to 31 members since the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. The documents will outline how NATO members should upgrade their forces and logistics. Allies will know exactly what forces and capabilities are needed, including where, what, and how to deploy. And so think of this. NATO is going to sit there. They're going to draw up new war plans against Russia for the first time since the Cold War. And they're going to pretend like Russia's a massive threat when a bunch of members, the conference is going to occur in a city that was a part of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Poland was, a member of the Warsaw Pact. All these countries that are a member of NATO now are former members of the USSR or the Warsaw Pact. And again, NATO is going to draw up these war plans like somehow Russia has become a bigger threat to the alliance over the past few years, when in reality it's the exact opposite. Throughout the war, there's been several countries that have maintained an interesting position where they certainly don't support or fall in any way in supporting Russia in its war in Ukraine. But at the same time, they definitely don't want to go along with the Western narrative. And two of these countries have been very close U.S. partners in Turkey, NATO ally, and then Tel Aviv. And so this is pretty interesting. This was Connor Freeman and Will Porter. My colleagues at the Libertarian Institute wrote this on May 18th. U.S. General, Israel made Iron Dome system ready for deployment in Ukraine. One of the two Israeli-manufactured Iron Dome batteries owned by the Pentagon is ready to be deployed to Ukraine, a U.S. general told the Senate on Thursday. Tel Aviv has so far refused to supply the anti-missile systems to Kiev in fear of provoking Russia and risking its ability to freely bomb Moscow's ally, Syria. During the Senate Strategic Forces Subcommittee hearing on Thursday, Senator Angus King pressed a senior Pentagon official on why Ukraine has not yet received the Iron Dome, noting the U.S. role in creating the air defense system. We spend something like $3 billion to send something like $3 billion to Israel to develop it. Wouldn't this be a very important resource for the Ukrainians, since their principal problem right now is missile defense, the lawmaker asked. And Angus King formerly was in Kiev, and so maybe this is where he got this information, because it doesn't seem like the kind of question that Angus King would really ask. It's kind of confrontational to the military. So the Army Space and Missile Command Chief General Daniel Carber replied that there are currently 2 Iron Dome batteries in the U.S. inventories, one of which is now ready for transfer to Kiev. One completed new equipment training, new equipment fielding, and is prepared for deployment. The other one is wrapping up its new equipment training right now, so the Army does have one available for deployment if it gets a request. While the U.S. has spent some $2.6 billion to fund the Iron Dome since 2011, it's produced in Israel, and Washington must see Tel Aviv's approval before any transfer to a third country. Ukrainian officials have repeatedly urged Israel to supply the system since Russia's invasion commenced last year, but Tel Aviv has been reluctant to fulfill the request, which could jeopardize its delicate relationship with Moscow. For years, Israel has dropped bombs on Syria, a key Russian ally in the Middle East, on a near weekly basis. Tel Aviv claims the consistent airstrikes are needed to counter Iranian proxies in the country, though they routinely target and kill Syrian soldiers as well as civilians, along with civilian infrastructure such as airports. Recently, Israel bombed the airport in Aleppo, and that was one of the closer airports to the earthquake damage after the major earthquake that killed thousands of people in Turkey and Syria, tens of thousands, I believe. So that's just kind of a little indicator of how brutal Israel's bombing of the country has been. Russia maintains a significant military presence in Syria, having intervened at the request of President Bashar al-Assad in 2015 to help beat back al-Qaeda-affiliated militants and the Islamic State fighters waging a dirty war on Damascus. And of course, those terrorists were supported by the U.S. and its allies, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Israel, of course, the very infamous Timber Sycamore program. John Brennan's Syrian terrorists is who a lot of these people are. Moscow has provided air defense systems to Syria, but permits Tel Aviv to carry out weekly attacks. The Israelis have launched hundreds of air raids in the country since the civil war began, and would prefer to maintain its freedom of action in the region rather than risking provoking the Kremlin with military aid to Ukraine. Last year, Kiev attempted to appeal to Israel's hawkishness to obtain the Iron Dome and other military hardware. In the letter to the Israeli Foreign Ministry, the Ukrainian embassy officials warned that Russia's use of Iranian drones could significantly contribute and strengthen Iran's potential of producing offensive weapons, and as a result, increase security threats for the state of Israel. But Tel Aviv refused to bite, and seeing little benefit in providing the Iron Dome to Ukraine, while also fearing that Russia could retaliate by providing Iran with advanced weaponry. Additionally, Tehran has repeatedly denied providing drones to Moscow since Russian President Vladimir Putin launched his war in Ukraine, claiming it has made no deliveries since the fighting began. The transfer proposed by General Karbler also makes little strategic sense, particularly given Ukraine's vast territory. The Israelis typically use the Iron Dome to shoot down low-tech rockets fired by Palestinian resistance factions in the besieged Gaza Strip, an open-air concentration camp which has been blockaded by the air, land, and sea for more than 15 years. A single Iron Dome battery would be of scant use in defending against Russia's long-range missiles. According to the Jerusalem Post analysis published this week, if Israel needs 10 or more Iron Domes to properly defend itself, Ukraine would need dozens or more, which simply do not exist. The outlet added that one or two Iron Domes from the U.S. would make no difference tactically at this point, probably would not even make much of a symbolic difference, and even then the Iron Dome may fail to shoot down Putin's more sophisticated missiles. And so they're saying, look, this missile system really isn't for what kind of fighting is going on in Ukraine. Assistant U.S. Defense Secretary for Space Policy John Plum has said Washington is not aware of any Israeli offer to make the transfer anyways. His statements came as Kiev blasted Israel for carrying out business as usual with Russian war criminals. Tel Aviv recently sent senior diplomats to Moscow for meetings with Russian officials. And so this is this weird thing that happened in the West, where after Russia invaded Ukraine, everything became about Ukraine, and other countries, even within the U.S. orbit, say, no, we have our own interest. And this absolutely makes Ukrainian officials and American officials irate at those countries for, continuing to do business with Russia, because it's economically beneficial and very important for some of these countries to maintain those ties. Next up here, Britain confirms Ukraine has used Storm Shadow missiles. So these are some air-fired missiles that the UK announced they were sending to Ukraine last week. And we had discussed on the show last week when these were sent that they were already in use. And so the UK probably waited till they were functional before saying that they were in use. The Wagner Group says that they have captured Bakhmut and they are going to hand that over to regular Russian forces in the coming week. So in a way, I think it's a good thing that the Battle of Bakhmut is over. This has long been described as a meat grinder, a bloody, nasty battle. The Ukrainians are now downplaying the significance of the loss. One thing to kind of just recap here, we had talked in recent weeks about some territory that Ukraine had retaken around Bakhmut, north and south of the city in more rural areas in the waning days of the fight for that city. So I think two things happened. In the south, it looks like it was a tactical error on the Wagner Group's part that allowed Ukraine to retake territory. In the north, it looks like Ukraine retook some territory to help defend the retreat. And so, by securing more roads and things like that, it was easier to get men, equipment, and stuff like that out of the city. So, the Ukrainians are saying, I saw Matt's Boot this morning posted a new article in the Washington Post. He was recently traveling to Kiev and has statements from a whole bunch of officials saying the war isn't going to be over till we recapture all of our territory. This isn't a big deal. And they're already downplaying it after they spent so many resources fighting for this city, even after their Western backers told them not to. All right. This is some news going on in the U.S. here. Republican senators introduced bill to scrap last nuclear arms treaty with Russia. It was introduced by Tom Cotton, and it would eliminate the New START treaty. This is, I think, still a really important agreement, even though it doesn't look like it's going to be extended past 2026, just given the relationship with Russia at this point, what's going on, how long the war in Ukraine is probably going to go on. It doesn't look like there's going to be a path to saving this agreement. However, there's no reason to withdraw from it 3 years early. And, maybe things change and there's time to save this agreement. So this is a terrible bill from Halts in Congress. Now, some interesting news on the peace talks. I did read this morning. I don't have a story up about it. But the president of Brazil, Lula, said that Zelensky skipped out on the meeting he was supposed to have with Brazil, which is, disappointing because Brazil, along with China, the African coalition, Turkey are some of the few nations that have somewhat proposed, somewhat benefit, like, you know, things that have moved in the right direction. They've had a little bit of success on the diplomatic end, you know, nothing concrete, nothing that actually translate into the battlefield, but, you know, they have gotten at least assent from each party that, hey, we're interested in talks. And so this isn't a bad thing. However, along with the meeting with Lula not going through, we have some other seemingly bad news here. Ukraine tells China it won't cede any territory for a peace deal. China's special representative for Eurasian Affairs, Li Hui, was in Ukraine on Tuesday and Wednesday to discuss the prospect of peace talks and meet with senior Ukrainian officials, including Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba and President Zelensky. According to the Ukrainian side, Kuleba met Lee told Lee that Ukraine won't agree to any deal that cedes any territory to Russia. Kuleba emphasized that Ukraine does not accept any proposals that would involve the loss of its territory or freezing the conflict. So no ceasefire. They have to regain all their territory. This, I'm sure, includes Crimea, includes the Donbass, and so Ukraine isn't putting forward anything that's really going to work. So this is interesting here. Move on to some more news about China, although we're still talking about the G7 summit. The joint communique released by the group of 7 leaders during the summit over the weekend in Hiroshima, Japan, took aim at China over several issues, but President Biden said Sunday that he expects a thaw in relations with Beijing. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan recently held a meeting with Chinese top diplomat Wang Yi, but for months beforehand, Beijing essentially cut off high-level contacts with Washington after Secretary of State Antony Blinken canceled a planned trip to China over the Chinese balloon that wound up over U.S. territory in February due to unexpected weather. Biden noted that he and Chinese President Xi appeared to maintain high-level communication when they went in Bali, Indonesia last November, and that silly balloon that was carrying 2 freight cars worth of spying equipment was flying over the United States and it got shot down and everything changed in terms of talking to one another. I think you're going to see that begin to thaw very shortly. And I think Biden is wrong. So we'll talk about a couple quick things here real quick. We have, let's see. Oh, so the U.S. wants to sign a deal to maintain military access in Micronesia. This is from last week from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. So this is, a country in the Asia Pacific that the U.S. really wants to have more and more military bases in that country, targeting China and Palau. Biden was supposed to go there to sign a defense agreement. My understanding is that defense cooperation agreement, that DCA, I think is still going to go through, but Biden is not going to visit Papua New Guinea because he is concerned about needing to be in the U.S. for deals regarding the debt ceiling. So he canceled that trip, but the U.S. is going to go ahead and, I believe, sign that agreement with Papua New Guinea, which to me suggests that China is going to see the Western, any kind of statement Biden has that, things might thaw. I'm not sure Beijing's going to go along with that, and so relations may not be thawing anytime soon. All right, with that, wrapping up the show. Hope everybody's enjoying it. If you got any feedback, always feel free to hit me up. Twitter is one of the easiest places to reach me on DM. You can also email me or leave a comment, post anywhere. I always appreciate it. And do what you can to support the show. I appreciate all of you. Thank you for tuning in.